All right, guys, I'm going to go over the Kingdom Plantae with you today. So what you need for this lesson is the note that I've given you on plants. And in addition to that, you need the note on the categorization of plants. Okay, so I'll be going back and forth between these. So we're going to start out with some easy stuff at the top, and then it gets a little bit more complicated. So these are the basic characteristics. You know how I go through that with every single kingdom. The only kingdom I didn't go through it with was Animalia, because I think the video does that for you. These are the characteristics of the plant kingdom that make it different than every other kingdom. So we know that plants are part of eukarya, which means they have a nucleus, an organized nucleus with a membrane. We know that plants are multicellular. So you're not going to get a plant that just has one cell. Okay, that would not be a plant. That would either be a fungus, it would be a protist. Even fungi are greater than one cell. All right, so you have to keep that in mind. They are larger than one cell. Plants are different than every other type of kingdom because they contain these things called plastids. So plastids are really important. Plastids are like the chloroplast, for instance. So they're an organelle that allows the plant to photosynthesize. Okay, so I will write that down for you. So these guys are organelles that allow for photosynthesis. Okay, so something you should know. Now, there are different types of plastids. The one that you would know most about would be the chloroplast. Okay, chloroplasts are green. So I'm not going to write that in here because, actually, I'll just highlight it. Okay, so I've got my green highlighter. So we'll go green for chloroplasts. All right, because they contain chlorophyll, which is green. Chromoplasts can be yellow, orange, red. These are the things that you see in the fall when the chloroplast is dying out. Okay, so chloroplast is really responsive to daylight, number of hours of day, and chloroplast dies or degenerates quicker in the fall than the chromoplast, and that's when we see the fact that the plants usually have chromoplasts working as well. You see those oranges, reds, and yellows. Leucoplasts are white, so we'll leave them like that. So a leucoplast is a white pigment, all right? And you can see those in flowers, for instance. Plants are autotrophs, which means they can make their own food, all right? So again, very different than most kingdoms. And how do plants make their own food? They make it through photosynthesis. So they grab a hold of radiant energy in their plastids, and they convert that into a chemical energy, which is, we usually call it glucose, but they can make oils as well. Plants contain cell walls made of cellulose. So that's different than every single other category as well. Okay, so those are the things that really make plants different. In addition to that, we can say most plants are land dwelling. Now we have to say most because there are water plants. So when we get to the plant unit, I'll go over different types of plants there as well. Okay, so we're going to cover some of the units today. We're covering some plants today. There's lots of information on it. Basically, what I'm showing you is the categorization of the plant kingdom today. When we get to the end of the school year, we'll have a couple weeks on plants, and then I'll give you more information there. So plants are mostly land dwelling. Keep in mind they can certainly live in water. Okay, all terrestrial plants, terrestrial means land dwelling plants, are sessile, which means they cannot move. Okay, they can't move from place to place. They can move their orientation as the day moves along. Okay, we'll go over that too as we go into plants, but they can't pick up and move like an animal can. Plants develop from embryos, okay, and plants can reproduce both sexually and asexually. So different than us there, okay, different than mammals. So they can reproduce sexually and asexually. The current hypothesis is that plants came from green algae. Okay, so that's their closest evolutionary relative. So we believe that plants came from algae, okay, which is a protist. Both green algae and plants, why do we believe this? Because some protists, as you know, plant-like protists contain chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, and plants also do. Plants have cellulose walls, okay, and so do protists. And they have similar DNA sequences, and so that's really the big one there too. Okay, if you look at the DNA of a plant and you look at the DNA of a plant like protists, their DNA is very, very similar, more similar than any other species or other organisms. Both green algae and plants store food energy in the form of starch, okay? So in other words, we believe plants got their beginning as green algae and picked up from there. Adaptations to life on land. Plants are protected from drying out, okay? So I'll go over how that happens in the next 5 or 6 pages. It's a very long note. Plants have a transport system for water. Most plants do. I'll talk to you about one that doesn't. But plants have a transport system for water and dissolved minerals. That's important. That's like our circulatory system. And they have a support system to keep them standing up, basically, okay? And so in terms of terrestrial plants, we're going to go over the 4 different phyla today, all right? And these are the 4 different phyla that we're going to go over. And this is what you're responsible for in this section of diversity for plants, okay? So moving on to page 2, plants can reproduce sexually. When they do that, it's called an alternation of generations. It's a really complicated process, okay? But what I want you to know is this. They make something called a sporophyte. You've seen spores now already with the other kingdoms, okay? So we've got a sporophyte. The sporophyte produces pores through meiosis. You've learned about meiosis. And you want to know that the sporophyte is diploid. So it has both sets of chromosomes from both plants. Okay, gametes. This is going to make more sense to you. When you see phyte, it always means plant. Okay, so a gametophyte is haploid. All right, it is the gamete of the plant. So plant gamete. All right, and it gives rise to haploid gametes, and that's what I just said. Okay, this is going to make sense too. The fusion, which means the connection or the joining of the male and the female gametes. Sorry, my ink is really running here. The fusion of the male and female gametes, which are gametophytes, produces a diploid zygote. Okay, so male plus female, those guys are called gametes, produces the diploid zygote, just like it would in a human being. And that zygote turns into a sporophyte. Okay, so instead of calling it a zygote, eventually it'll be called, instead of calling it a fetus, it would be called a sporophyte. And the mature sporophyte produces spores by meiosis. So in other words, gametes come together to produce a sporophyte. The sporophyte matures, and then it will produce spores by meiosis, which will then form gametes again. So that's why it's called a cycle or an alternation of generations. All right. What I've highlighted is what you have to know. Non-vascular plants are called bryophytes. So we're finally starting with some vascular and non-vascular plants here. Okay, so we're looking at categorization. So for a moment here, I'm going to take you back to this page. Okay, and don't worry about this. I'm going to get to this when I get to these plants. But notice, all plants divided into vascular and non-vascular plants. Okay, so this is where we are right now. What's a vascular system? It's like a circulatory system for plants. So you remember the xylem and the phloem? You've learned about those for years and years, even in elementary school. These plants would not have xylem and phloem. Okay, so we've got vascular and non-vascular plants. These guys are lacking a vascular system, which is like a circulatory system. And this is what you and I are looking at right now. Okay, so non-vascular plants are called bryophytes. Okay, so you could be familiar with that. These guys are the bryophytes. They are the first land plants that we know of. Okay, so obviously complex came from simple. These guys are simple. They're simple land-dwelling plants. They include mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. There's some pictures down here that are not great on my diagram. Of course, you can always look them up and add your own diagrams. They have no vascular tissue. Okay, so that means they don't have roots, they don't have a transport system, they don't have any xylem and phloem. All right, so if that helps, because when we get to it, you're probably going to be writing about xylem and phloem. These guys have no phloem and no xylem. Okay, no vascular tissue. So what does that mean? Very easy to understand. If you can't transport water and minerals, you've got to stay really, really small. Okay, so these guys are very low lying. They don't have roots. They don't have any kind of vascular system. So here we go, no roots. Oh, sorry. They have a root-like structure called a rhizoid, but it's not a real root. Okay, it's a rhizoid. And when you look at them, they're very, very close to the ground. So this might look like it's tall. I hope it doesn't look tall to you, but they're very, very short, okay? So these are your land-dwelling plants that don't have a vascular system and they don't get tall. Think about a tree and then think about a moss growing about this high off of some patio stones, okay? Very, very short. Why? Because they cannot transport water. So they have to live in environments that are moist. They cannot survive in environments that are not moist. So they live in damp, dark, shady places typically. Okay, typically. They can grow in the sun. I do have a little bit of moss growing on my patio stones, but those patio stones are shaded later on in the day. So they can survive in some sun. They have little or no resistance to drying out because they don't have a vascular system. They lack vascular tissue. Let's highlight that. I've said it many times. And like sponges, animal sponges, they take in water lying on their surface, okay? So they just soak in water and they can't transport it anywhere. So if as soon as the environment dries out, they die. All right, so they cannot live in an environment that is not moist. And these guys are really important in primary succession. So I won't highlight that for you. I won't ask you about it if it's not highlighted right now. But what this means is that once a forest fire comes in, I'm going to use the example of a forest fire, any kind of devastating natural disaster, these guys are the first ones to return. Okay, so their spores return, they form, and what they do is they can make soil. So if they're living on a rock, as they survive, they can slowly turn that rock into soil, and that brings about life for other plants. So then the forest can come back slowly based on these guys. All right, and so now we have vascular plants, okay? The tracheophytes. So now we're going into another category of plant, tracheophytes. They demonstrate increased levels of organization. They have organs and organ systems. So now we're getting into a complex plant. They have specialized transporting tissue. What is that tissue? Xylem and phloem. Xylem transports water. Phloem transports dissolved sugar. So there's obviously water in the sugar. They are larger and more complex than your bryophytes, so they can get larger. Okay, and so at this point, we go to two types of vascular plants. Okay, so we're back on this diagram here. Plants, all plants, vascular versus non-vascular. We have done that. Vascular plants, we're looking at seedless first. So we're going to look at the pteridophytes and the lycophytes. All right, so I wrote that down for you. It takes a moment and write that down so that the note makes more sense. Okay. This is not usually the note I use. It's not a bad one, but it's the one I was able to copy when I had 15 minutes to get into the school. Okay, so the note I'm giving you is very extensive. It's very good, but the formatting is not great. And these titles are not present all the time either. So we're looking at seedless plants now, and we're looking at the pteridophytes and the lycophytes. Okay, and so there are your titles. Okay. And these guys reproduce via spores. So they use spores. They do not use seeds. They use spores. All right, so that's different. They consist of plants called ferns. Okay, ferns are something that a lot of people put out, especially on their porches if they've got a wraparound porch at this time of year. So ferns, your parents might have some ferns, club mosses, horsetails, whisk ferns. Okay, and so here are some pictures of them. I'm not going to give you pictures and ask you to identify if this is like a horsetail. I won't ask you to do that, okay? I'm just giving you examples in case you have some at home. Lots of species worldwide, all right? And so those are your examples. And now we're going to move into plants with seeds. So these guys are called plants with seeds, okay? So plants with seeds. All right, and so plants with seeds are over here, and we've got two different types. We've got angiosperms and gymnosperms, and we're going to cover the gymnosperms first. So we've covered this, and now we're looking at plants with seeds, and these guys are the gymnosperms. So for the next little bit, I'm going to be going over gymnosperms, then I'll progress to angiosperms, monocots, and dicots. Okay, so gymnosperms now. Gymnosperms, this would be something I would really want you to know, is they are cone bearing. So think of pine cones, okay? Literally cone bearing. They're a small group of plants that do not flower and produce seeds on the surface of a reproductive structure. What is that reproductive structure? It's a cone, okay? And they are called naked seeds. So why do we call them naked seeds? Because if you think about a seed, usually it's going to have like a hard outer covering. These guys are like fluff, okay? Even a dandelion with all its fluff, when you touch a dandelion seed, you can feel that hard shell on top of it, okay? So it's fluffy on parts to get the seed moving, but the actual seed is covered with an enclosure. These guys are not like that. So the cone itself, understand this, the cone itself is not the seed. The cone opens up and then the seed comes out, okay? So these guys are the most primitive seed bearing plants that we have, all right? They're hypothesized to have evolved about 360 million years ago. I'm not going to ask you about that. They're divided into 4 groups, okay? So the conifers are one group, the cycads, and I'm going to go over these very briefly. Do be aware that there's not just one type, all right? We've got 4 different types here. And notice phyta means plant, okay? So they're all different types of plants. So super quickly, you don't have to know much about this, okay? But we've got our gymnosperms. They are vascular plants with seeds, and the seeds are fluffy, and they are naked seeds, okay? You need to know that there are male cones and there are female cones, okay? So that might be something that you don't know. The female cones are larger, they're harder, and they are more resistant, okay? The male cones are soft and short-lived. So sperm and pollen grains from a male cone will fertilize the female eggs on the female cones. That should make sense to you, okay? So male fertilizes female. All right, and I've already said that the females are larger, just like a female egg is larger. Kind of cool that they have evolved the same way we have. And the sperm are smaller. All right, and so here are different types of gymnosperms. You have your conifers. These are the ones you're going to be most familiar with because we see these in Canada. All right, so they're large and most familiar group of gymnosperms. They can range in size from tall trees to small plants or junipers. So your parents might have junipers. You're going to see these guys in a lot of people's gardens because people like them. Okay, they're low-lying and they do really well. Widely distributed throughout the world. They prefer cold temperature. That's why we see them here in Canada, and high elevation, okay? Most conifers are evergreens, so keep that in mind when you think of a conifer. They retain their green leaves all year long, and we'll talk about needles and adaptations when we get to the plant unit, all right? And they do shed their needles sometimes, okay? About 2 to 5 years, every 2 to 5 years. So you might see that happen in your backyard. The cycads are large plants that are similar to palms in appearance, all right? So they are similar to palms. Think of a palm tree. They have sharp spines for protection from predators, all right? Why? Because some of them favor a semi-arid environment. So semi-arid means semi-dry. So some of them are going to struggle for water, all right? And what's interesting here is many are poisonous, all right? They have toxic chemicals. Okay, the ginkgos are a group of plants that have a fan-shaped leaf. They are very resistant to pests and pollution, okay? So these are extremely hardy plants. They can grow over 30 meters in height. That's huge. You're not going to see them here. They don't live in Canada. Deciduous trees that shed their leaves every year, all right? They're often found in temperate regions, temperate regions, so regions that have different temperatures and can live up to 1,000 years. All right, and so I'm going to just say that if you went to China, that's where you would find many of these guys. The gnatophytes prefer subtropical and tropical. Okay, so we're not going to see those in Canada, and they consist of 71 species. So not too much I'm going to ask you about these different groups. If anything, I just wanted to make you familiar with them. All right, angiosperms. You need to know about angiosperms. So now we've done gymnosperms, naked seeds, to angiosperms that are going to have a covered seed. Okay, and what we need to get to now are the monocots versus the dicots. So I'm going to start you off with angiosperms. These plants produce seeds. They have not a naked seed. So this is a naked seed when we have gymnosperms. So it's not protected in that shell, and this is a protected seed. Okay, so what's important here, not the different types of gymnosperms, but that you understand this categorization. Okay, this is quite important here. So angiosperms are seed-bearing plants that produce flowers. Okay, so this is a big deal too, that they produce flowers. So let's draw a flower here to associate that with your angiosperms. Okay, and if you want to put that on your other sheet, that's very important as well. They produce flowers. Okay, so more than 90% of all modern species are angiosperms. So in other words, guys, they did extremely well, all right? So they dominate the earth, these plants here. So more than 90% of all modern plants are angiosperms for various reasons, including the fact that humans like them, all right? So we obviously grow these guys more often. They have a specialized structure for sexual reproduction. That specialized structure is a flower. Okay, we're going to look at the flower. This goes through what the flower does. I'll go through it with you on the diagram. Flowers are small. Flowers that can be non-colorful. I'm really messing up here. Flowers that are small or non-colorful rely on the wind to transport the pollen for pollination. Okay, flowers that are large and colorful or have patterns have pleasant odors and foods that will attract pollinators such as bees. It's not to say that these guys won't be distributed by wind. It's just it's more likely that the larger the flower, the more colorful the flower, the more the bee is going to notice it and get the pollen stuck to its body. Okay? And so here are a various number of different types of flowers. Okay, you can look at them. You need to know about a cotyledon. So a cotyledon is the very first leaf that comes out of the seed. So when you guys were young and in elementary school, and even now you might like this, you'd put seeds into soil and you would grow your seeds, okay? The very first little leaf that made everybody excited to come out, that's called the cotyledon, all right? And so here's where we get into monocots and dicots. A monocotyledon has one cotyledon. Cotyledon is the first leaf that appears out of the seed. Okay, so when the plant germinates, it grows a root. You might not see that unless you have a see-through cup, but then the children that are planting these seeds or anybody that's planting seeds is looking for that cotyledon to come up. If there's one seed leaf, it's called a monocot. If there are two seed leaves, it's called a dicot. All right, and so corn, orchids, onions, grass are monocots. Dandelions, maple trees, just a couple examples there are dicots, all right? This goes through different categorizations of monocots and dicots. So you have that here. I'm going to take you through this one instead, okay? So we've got gymnosperms versus angiosperms. Here are some things that make them different, all right? So you can look those over. Mostly you've got flowers in a seed and you've got a naked seed there. Most angiosperms are insect pollinated, but they can certainly be pollinated by the wind. And most gymnosperms are usually wind pollinated. Again, it's not to say an insect can't grab that hold of that pollen, but it's just more typical that the wind is going to distribute the pollen, okay? Angiosperms can be evergreen or deciduous. Deciduous is what you and I have here mostly. We've got plants that shed their leaves in the fall, okay? In case you're wondering what that means. And evergreens keep their leaves all year round. So these are like our Christmas trees, all right? We're going to have xylem vessels and xylem tracheids. That's going to be something that's going to come back to us when we get to the plant unit itself, all right? So keep this for the plant unit because it's going to help you through. Now, let's have a look at this diagram, okay? So monocots versus dicot. Again, here's your cotyledon, okay? Monocotyledon. You have one seed leaf. So picture grass. It's the best one to picture because grass is a monocot. There's only one leaf for every single seed that you would plant, okay? So there's our seed leaf right there. That's our cotyledon. When we get to a dicot, we have two seed leaves. There's one and there are two, okay? And they're attached over here. So when you plant your seeds, like if you were planting beans, for instance, we would see that it would be a dicot, and you'd get 2 little leaves that would sprout up from the soil. After that, then you get the real leaves that come up. Okay, so the cotyledons are those oval shaped leaves. They look like this. Okay, if this is a dicot, you get these 2 little leaves, and then after those guys have photosynthesized and given some energy to the plant will grow the next leaf, and the next leaf will look different. Okay, we'll see some venation in it, and it'll have a different shape. Okay, it could have a different shape altogether than this cotyledon. All right. Okay, now here's another difference. Monocots have fibrous roots. So in other words, they've got roots that spread out. Okay, different evolutionary background, different tactic. They're going to be spreading out through the surface of the soil, trying to catch as much rain as they can after rainfall, and they don't dig deep to try and get to the water table. A dicot has a different strategy. It digs deeper, okay? So this is your dandelion, for instance. If you don't dig the whole dandelion root out, it's dug deep. Even if we leave just a little section of it, this guy is trying to get closer to the water table where the soil is more moist. If you leave that, the whole thing grows back, okay? So carrot is another example of a dicot. When we get to the plant unit, I'm going to go over this in greater detail, but if you look at a stem, okay, if we look at the stem and we look at where the xylem and the phloem are, in a monocot, they're just scattered, okay, so they're just randomly placed. In a dicot, they form a ring. Now this diagram is not perfect at showing you that, but these guys are organized in a ring structure around the stem. Okay, there's nothing in the center. These guys are just randomly scattered. All right, and then when we get to leaves with monocots, we see that they are parallel in venation. So in other words, these are the veins. Here, the veins will contain the xylem and the phloem, and they're running parallel to each other, like King Street and Barton, all right, and Queenston. So running parallel. When we look at a dicot, these guys have net-like venation, so they're spreading out. Okay, notice that they're spreading out there. So they're not running in this direction, they're spreading away from each other, and that's called net-like venation. And the last difference between monocots and dicots, visible difference, is that monocots always have their flowers, not their leaves, guys, their flowers. Their flower petals are in multiples of 3. So the Ontario trillium, the flower of Ontario, is a monocot. All right, it would have all of these features, and if you just looked at it, it would have 3 petals on its leaf. Okay, when you get to a dicot, they're going to have petals in groups of 4 or 5. Okay, so they won't have 3, they'll have 4 or 5. That's probably the easiest way to actually distinguish between them. All right, so now just finishing up here, it's been a very long lesson for you. Structure of a seed in an angiosperm. So a seed is where the plant stores the embryo. Okay, so a seed is to a plant what an embryo is to an animal. It has been fertilized. Okay, the pollen has reached the ovule, and they've made a little baby. So an organism in its early stages of development, that's the seed. What I'm going to get you to do, okay, this is your job. I want you to tell me the function of each of these things, okay? And it's not hard to find that, all right? So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You can write the function for them here. I don't need to know about structure. You need to know about function. The seed coat consists of 3 main parts. So you've got your seed coat, the outside of the seed, right? That's what differs between this and a seed that's a naked seed, like a gymnosperm. There's an endosperm. You're going to tell me what that consists of. What does it do? And then the embryo is obviously the developing little plant. All right, so those are things that I want you to give me the function of. The embryo will develop into different tissues that will make up the plant. The other parts of the seed play many roles, and you're going to find those out. What I'd like you to know, I'm just switching to yellow just because it's a little bit brighter and I like it better that way. The seed coat protects the seed, okay? And I want you to know that a seed can be dormant, and a seed can be dormant for many, many years. Sorry, I just noticed you can't see that. A seed can be dormant for many years. So if we were in school, we would germinate seeds in June. And those seeds that I've had in there, those radish seeds, they have a germination period of about like 3 days, so it doesn't take us long to get them to have the cotyledon come out. But they've been there for about 15 years. That's the point I'm trying to make. So I've had those seeds for a very, very long time. So seeds can stay dormant for a very long time. So dormancy is a period in which the embryo is alive, but it is not active or growing. All right. And so some parts of that seed are obviously feeding that embryo for a period of time. And what part feeds it is the endosperm. So I've given you a little bit of your answers here already. Okay. Serves as the food source, providing high energy food for the developing embryo. Once the embryo starts to develop, it's going to need a lot of energy, and the endosperm will provide it with that energy. All right. Okay, so now we're just going to go into the last topic, which is flowers. Okay, and flowers, I know from experience, you've seen in elementary school. So this should not be new to you, but I'm just going to do a quick little recap so that you know that flowers have male and female parts both. So read this over. I'm going to go with the diagram here. Okay, so here's our flower. And let us, oh, it's already pink. So I'm going to say the female parts are, let's go with female. I'm going to make orange. Oh, that's male. So let's go with female. Orange. Okay. And male, let's do that in yellow. Okay. So the female part is this part of the flower here, just as a recap. So there's always only one female part. Okay. And it consists of these three places. So you've got the stigma. The stigma is sticky. Okay, so we're going to make our own little notes here. The stigma is sticky. Why is it sticky? Because it's trying to attract pollen. Okay, so the stigma is sticky. The style is just a tube that leads to the ovary. And this is the ovary here. Okay, so this section here is the ovary. What's in the ovary? An ovule. So an ovule sounds a lot like a female egg, just like we would have it in a human being. And this is basically the plant egg. Okay, so it's not fertilized. It's where the plant stores its female gametes. So we're going to have female gamete, in other words. Okay, so it's the egg. The male part of the plant, you've got lots of them. Okay, so this flower here is showing you, and once the tulips come up, this would be an excellent example. If you just go into your garden, if you have tulips, tulips show you their different reproductive structures, okay? They're really good at that. So the male part is called the stamen, and I always think men, stamen, there's the word men in there, you know that's the male part. You've got the anther and the filament. So what the anther does is this produces the pollen. Okay, so that produces your pollen, and the filament is just the tube holding the anther up there. Okay, so the anther makes pollen. So if you're allergic to pollen, you have to blame the anthers at this time of year. These guys are producing pollen, and the pollen can either go right to the same plant and land on the stigma. That is called self-pollination. Okay, just so that you're aware of that. So if the pollen goes like this to this plant, that's self-pollinating. You're going to get a sharing of gametes from the same flower, so you're not going to get a lot of variability. Or the anther a little bee can come in here and miss that stigma, and it can go to another flower. If that pollen goes to another flower, that's called cross-pollination. Okay, so if the pollen leaves, then you've got cross-pollination, so you're sharing gametes between different plants or different flowers. And if it's going in this direction, then that is self-pollination. Okay, self-pollination leads to a lot less genetic variability. Okay, and sometimes that's exactly what a gardener wants, because if they're making a pink flower, they might not want a white flower, right? So that if you're not allowing them to share their gametes, then that works for the farmer as well. All right, so that's your intro. That's not your intro, that's your note on plants. Just one more thing I do want to tell you. The female plant is often referred to as the carpel. Okay, so we've got the stamen and we've got the carpel, and the carpel is also known as the pistil. Okay, so either one, carpal, pistil, same thing. The style just connects the two. All right, and you've got some information down here. Pollination is just when you've got your female and your male gametes meeting. Okay, don't worry about this. All right, we've already gone through the alternation of generation, but what we want to know is that once the pollen lands on the stigma, then we have pollination. Okay, that is your long, long note. I'm going to give you just a couple of questions. So I'm giving you 2 days on plants because I know that this has been already probably a good 45 minutes, maybe not. I'm not sure because I can't see my little clock on my phone. And I'm giving you 3 hours of work a week. Okay, so we've already covered enough work for a couple of days here. I'll give you a few questions in your textbook. And this is all the information now at this point that you're going to need to do the quiz. Okay, so I'm just going to pull my stuff out here and make sure I'm telling you that correctly. Yes, so we are doing plants on Tuesday, Wednesday. Thursday's lesson, I'll give you some information on what it is you should be looking at and reviewing. You can start your own reviews by all means, and I will post that review sooner than later. So I'll probably post it on Wednesday so that those of you that are done can have a look at that review and start forming your reviews. And then you'll have your quiz you can start it on Thursday as well. Okay, open book, obviously. And I'm going to write the quiz tomorrow, which for me is really Tuesday. This is Monday for me. And I'll post information on that quiz as soon as I write it. All right, take care.